So, Dr. Kenyako, founder of the West Africa Oil Watch, if you can, please give me a little bit of context and help me understand exactly what the problems are that we are addressing with the
Yeah.
West Africa Oil Watch.
Sure, thank you very much. Thank you very much for visiting our website, the westafricaoilwatch.org. It's a pleasure to have you here. The issues are very complicated, especially as relates to the region and the oil industry. So all throughout the West Africa sub-region, oil is being discovered in commercial quantity, from Senegal right down to Angola. There's been massive activities in the commercial extraction of oil. And this in itself is a very important development for a region that has been very unstable over the last 2 decades or so. According to various research that is being done, currently West Africa provides about 7% of the world's oil production activities. So that's a massive development for the region more specifically. And it's also 1/3 of the world's new oil discoveries are in this region. So that includes not just Liberia, which is Nigeria, which is the main power, but also other countries that are going to be first-time oil producers. So that's a very interesting development. And so the discovery of oil, most of which is offshore, has brought a lot of optimism. There's a lot of excitement, especially amongst the oil industry, but also amongst the host governments, because often oil is seen as some kind of a silver bullet to the ills that inflict or afflict these sorts of societies. But with this excitement has also come concern about, there's discussion about the so-called resource cores, whether these resources would actually benefit the people, because there's a lot of evidence, especially when you consider what's happening in Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, in these sort of countries where they've been producing oil for a very long time, but it hasn't benefited the local people. And often oil in itself can be more of a curse than a blessing if it is not managed properly. So by all indications, West Africa should be benefiting from these oil activities that are going on. To start with, the region is now relatively stable than it was, say, 10-15 years ago. Most of the civil wars have sort of concluded. Of course, there's the activity going on in Mali and the instability in Cote d'Ivoire. But for the most part, the civil wars that imploded in the 1990s have sort of been contained. There's also a massive input in foreign direct investment into the region. There's a lot of resources that are flowing in, both from private sources, but also from multinational governmental agencies. So that's very important as well. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, there's also a lot of civil society awakening, where a lot of groups that become aware of what the possibilities are in making the region a much more prosperous place. But as I mentioned already, these developments have also raised concerns amongst different set of actors about its impact on peace and stability, development, rule of law, justice, gender, and women's empowerment, and things like that. So it's a very interesting development to see exactly how this would play out. I think part of this concern is justified because West Africa is saturated with what we call weak states. A lot of these states are emerging from war, or they've undergone some kind of a social instability, and so that impacts their capacity both to manage statecraft, but also to be able to manage different competing interests that often emerge from societies that often find themselves with oil wealth. The other issue also that is of concern is corruption, and how this will impact the political landscape once oil wells start flowing into countries that are relatively weak. So again, the event in some of these countries, we've seen the case of Nigeria, where between 1960 and 1990, I mean, well over 400 billion dollars have been wasted, according to the UNOCD. And so that again is an indicator of the types of challenges that the sub-region faces in managing the sudden flow of oil wealth into the region. So for once, just imagine the amount of social economic development that would have taken place if this money had been used the right way. So corruption, I think, it's a major issue that is of concern. There's also the issue of human rights. Human rights, it often tends to be very prevalent in societies emerging from war, but also those that suddenly have to deal with the sudden flow of oil wealth. Governments often tends to emphasize state security over human security. And so when you have an alliance between the government, host governments, and the oil companies that doesn't take into cognizance the concerns of local populations, then that's a recipe for human rights abuses. So I think these are just some of the various issues that are of concern. There's also the issue of the tactics that are often employed by these oil companies. They often use divide and rule policies in terms of how they deal with different communities, and so that inflames tensions at the community level between various social groups. And so it's important to also look at these policies to make sure that they reflect the concerns of the society where oil is being discovered. And also, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the oil is being discovered offshore. So whilst this might minimize the tensions between the communities and local authorities and the oil companies, but also these offshore sites often are fishing zones, and this will have a major impact on the livelihoods of millions of people who depend on the fishing communities for their basic survival. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the oil industry is a very opaque industry, and it's often done deliberately so, where the average person doesn't know quite as much about how the industry actually operates. So for example, if you take the issue of oil contracts are basically treated as state secrets. Both government and the oil companies often citing maybe competition rules or security or whatever it is. They often make sure that these documents are not available in the public domain, and this also has, I think, major implications. If we are to fight corruption and help to properly manage these resources so that it actually benefits the people, I think that should be really the next stage, where both the government and the oil companies should make it part of the contract, I think, to make as much of these contracts available in the public domain, so that people can actually see, I think, the content of these, and also maybe provide some kind of guidelines in terms of how these resources should be managed. So I think that's where the West Africa Oil Watch comes in. There are a lot of very interesting and important organizations that are working on this sector. EITI, the Extractives Industry Initiative, I think that's a very good initiative that's going on. Transparency International, pay what you publish what you pay. I think these are all very interesting campaigns that are very interesting for the region. But the West Africa Oil Watch specifically focuses on the West Africa region, partly because of its growing significance, I think, to the international oil market. Also because we believe for a region that has experienced a lot of civil conflict, it is a particularly fragile sub-region that I think requires a lot of attention, because as we're seeing in the case of Mali, whatever happens in West Africa I think will have major implications for international peace and security. The West Africa Oil Watch also believes in the approach of a people-centric approach to the oil sector. That unless and until we take into cognizance that these policies and programs impact the lives of people, it impacts the lives of various social groups, then these problems I think are just going to persist. They will insist into the long run, and they will even end up becoming a source of different kinds of conflict. So again, we use a region-wide type of approach where we work with different communities in different parts of the region to raise awareness about the issues relating to oil and peace and stability, and to build some kind of a groundswell of civil society support where both the government, the oil companies, and the private sector, including as well civil society, can all come together as equals to actually debate in an open manner the best ways in which this resource can be utilized to benefit the people of West Africa, and to make it a much more transparent undertaking. So there's a lot of work to be done. We're very happy that at least you're listening to this video, and we hope you can join us to make this undertaken reality. Thank you very much.